Welcome to Night Shift Pulse. Comment your city and the time below. The night connects us all. If you enjoy what you hear, please subscribe. Let's step into the dark. I watched the floodlights stutter one last time before they steadied into a hard, white glare, and the entire yard seemed to hold its breath with me. On Monitor 7, the access aisle I had just walked through no longer existed. It was not dark. It was not out of frame. It was replaced cleanly with a wall of stacked sedans that had not been there 10 minutes earlier. I remember turning in my chair to look out the shack window and seeing the same thing in real life. The cars, the crushed metal, the geometry of the place rewritten as if it had always been that way. My radio clicked once like someone pressing a talk button with no intention of speaking, and then I heard my own voice say very calmly, "Stay on the safe side," from a channel that was not assigned to any unit. I took the job because it was simple. That was how it was presented, and that was how I understood it when I signed the paperwork in a small office that smelled like printer toner and stale coffee. Overnight watchman, asset security, perimeter integrity, hourly check-ins, a set patrol route, a working flashlight, a radio, and a guard shack with a bank of monitors that covered the entrances and the primary lanes. There were no customers after dusk, no forklifts running at night, no trucks coming in except the occasional late drop that had to be scheduled and approved. The yard closed at 5, the last crew clocked out, and whatever remained was mine to keep still until morning. The yard itself sat out in western Utah, high desert, far enough from town that you could forget what a streetlight looked like. A privately owned scrapyard and vehicle reclamation site with a chain-link perimeter and 3 layers of control. The gate, the fence, and the fact that nobody wanted to walk into a place full of sharp metal and bad footing in the dark. On a map, it was a rectangle in a sea of pale nothing. In person, it was a maze of stacked vehicles, crushed steel cubes and rows of stripped cars waiting for parts to be pulled or flattened. It had its own smell. Hot dust in the day, cold iron at night, and always a faint note of old fuel that never truly went away. I had done security work before, not glamorous. A few years bouncing between warehouses, construction sites, and a distribution center where the biggest excitement was catching someone trying to walk out with a pallet of shrink-wrap detergent. I preferred night work because it was quiet and because I did not have to pretend to be sociable. My name is Grant, and I had learned that if you speak plainly, show up on time, and fill out your logs correctly, most places will leave you alone. That suited me. The scrapyard promised the same thing, with better pay. Better pay was the hook, but it was not the only reason I said yes. I needed the hours. I needed the consistency. I had a lease coming up, a truck that ran only because I listened to what it needed before it broke, and a general fatigue with jobs where your supervisor used phrases like team culture while doing nothing to maintain basic safety signage. The owner's representative who hired me was a man named Parker. Mid-40s, sunburned at the edges, a voice that always sounded like it had just come back from yelling across a distance. He walked me through the basics in a way that suggested he had done it too many times. He showed me the gate controls, the keypad, the camera coverage, and the shack. The shack was a prefabricated unit with a small desk bolted to the floor, a steel cabinet for keys and forms, and a wall-mounted monitor rack with 16 feeds. There was a clipboard with a blank incident log sheet. There was a binder labeled Overnight Protocol. There was a cheap coffee maker that had seen better days and a small space heater that would either do nothing or make the air smell like burnt dust. "You'll do a perimeter sweep when you come on," Parker said. "You'll do hourly sweeps after that. Mostly you'll sit in here and keep an eye on things. If someone breaches the gate, you call it in. If you see lights, you call it in. If a sensor trips, you call it in." "What about wildlife?" I asked. He shrugged. "Coyotes, rabbits. Sometimes a cow gets out from somebody's range and tries to push through. We had a mule deer take itself out on the fence last winter. That was a mess. You'll see eyes in the floodlights, but it's not your job to chase anything. You're not animal control? The floodlights were mounted on poles around the yard and aimed inward. Their light was strong and flat, the kind that made everything look the same shade of tired. They created deep pockets of shadow behind stacks of cars and in the gaps between rows. The yard had lanes referred to as access aisles wide enough for a forklift and a flatbed. There were sections, row groups, a crushing area, a parts pull area, a scale house near the entrance that was locked at night. And in the back, where the fence line dipped and the desert rose, a section that Parker referred to as old inventory. Old inventory? I asked, mostly to make conversation. Stuff we haven't processed yet, he said. We'll get to it when we get to it. He handed me an employee badge and an access fob. The badge had my photo and a number printed under it. Badge number 3169. He told me to keep it visible on my shirt when on shift, even though nobody would be there to check. He told me to sign in on a sheet inside the shack and to call into the owner's off-site line once an hour, on the hour, just to confirm everything was normal. It was a redundancy, he said, a way to prove someone was awake. You'll be solo, he added. No partner, it's just you. If you need backup, you call the county. If there's a fire, you call the county. We're not running a hero program out here. All of it was exactly what I wanted. Clear expectations, no extra duties, a physical space that was not a retail floor or a lobby. I nodded, asked the right questions, and took the keys. My first shift started at 8 in the evening. The desert still held some warmth when I pulled in. The sky a deepening gradient that felt too large for the human brain to hold comfortably. The gate was open. A day crew truck was pulling out as I arrived, its taillights briefly painting the fence red. I parked near the shack, shouldered my small bag, and stepped inside. The air was cooler in there, stale, with that same toner and old coffee smell. The monitors were on, each feed showing a different angle. Gate, scale, main lanes, back fence lines. The cameras were labeled in the corner, camera A1, A2, B1, and so on. Some were black and white in low light, some were color washed out by the floodlights. I found the sign-in sheet and wrote my name and the date, spelling everything in careful block letters. I checked the radio. I checked the flashlight. I opened the protocol binder and flipped through it. It was standard. Perimeter sweep. Check padlocks. Verify gate secure. Check camera blind zones by walking the lane and confirming nothing obstructed the feed. Record any anomalies. Call in hourly. Then when I opened the steel cabinet to look for extra batteries, I saw the rules. They were taped to the inside of the cabinet door with yellowing tape, a single sheet of lined paper with handwriting that was tight and controlled. It was not printed. It was not laminated. It looked like someone had written it in a hurry, but with a steady hand. The kind of handwriting you get from people who fill out forms for a living. There was no signature, no date, no company letterhead, just a title at the top, underlined twice. Night rules. I read them once without fully understanding because my mind treated them as a joke at first, the way you treat an office prank or a leftover note from a previous shift. Then I read them again, slower. Rule 1. Do not walk the perimeter fence after midnight. Camera verification only. Rule 2. If you hear metal moving where there is no wind, stay in the shack until it stops. Rule 3. Do not use the flashlight beam to search the back rows. Use floodlights only. Rule 4. If you see a person beyond the east access aisle, do not acknowledge them. Close the blinds. Wait 10 minutes. They will leave if you do not make them real. Rule 5. The yard does not like being counted. Do not inventory at night. Rule 6. If the radio clicks twice in a row, do not respond even if you hear your name. Rule 7. Never step into the aisle marked with orange tape. If you have already stepped in. Do not look back for the tape. It will not be there. Rule 8. At 3:14 in the morning, all monitors may show the same feed. This is not a power issue. Close your eyes until you hear the office line ring. Rule 9. If you receive a if call from inside the yard, do not answer. There are no phones in the yard. Rule 10. If the time clock shows a time you did not live through, write it down and do not attempt to correct it. I stood there with the cabinet door open, my hand resting on the edge, the paper inches from my face. The rules were specific in the way that superstitions are not. They referenced actual equipment, actual procedures. It had the cadence of someone who had seen the same problems repeat and had tried to build a fence out of words. I did what professionals do when they encounter something outside their scope. I checked for official documentation. The protocol binder did not mention any of it. There was no memo, no addendum. The rules were not referenced anywhere. There was no company stamp. So I did what people do when they encounter something unofficial but potentially relevant. I asked management. I called Parker on the off-site line. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "This is Grant," I said. I started my shift. "There's a handwritten list taped inside the cabinet. A set of rules. Is that something you put there?" Silence. Then Parker exhaled through his nose in a way that sounded tired. "There's always something," he said. "Is it the list?" "It says night rules at the top," I said. "Yeah," he said, and his tone changed slightly, as if he was moving from annoyance into something like caution. "That's not mine." "So who wrote it?" "Not me," he said, "and not any supervisor I know. Probably some previous guy trying to mess with the new hire." "It's detailed," I said. "It references specific times, equipment." Parker made a sound like he was rubbing his forehead. "Listen, we've had turnover in that shack. Guys get bored. They write stories. They scare themselves. You follow the official protocol, you'll be fine." "You want me to remove it?" I asked. He paused long enough that I noticed it and then said, "No, leave it. It's not hurting anything. Just don't take it as gospel." That should have been the end of it. Unofficial note, workplace folklore, a way to make a quiet shift feel less empty. I hung up, sat down at the desk and looked at the monitors again. The yard sat under the floodlights like a staged photograph. Nothing moved except the wind tugging at a loose strip of plastic caught in a fence corner. The audio feed, where available, was mostly the low hum of distant highway noise and the occasional rattle of chain link. The desert night had its own rhythm, wind rising, settling, rising again like breathing. I told myself the rules were a joke. I told myself they were a superstition written by someone who needed to make long hours feel like a challenge. Then I noticed the orange tape. On monitor 12, which covered one of the back access aisles, there was a line of orange hazard tape stretched across the entrance to a lane. It was tied to a post on one side and a stacked rim pile on the other. It was not in the official yard map. Parker had not mentioned it, but there it was, bright in the floodlight, an artificial boundary in a place already defined by boundaries. I leaned forward, squinted, and felt a small, unpleasant tightening in my chest. Rule 7. Never step into the aisle marked with orange tape. I told myself that the tape was probably there for safety. Maybe unstable stacks, maybe a sinkhole, maybe an area with sharp scrap that needed cleanup. It made sense. But why would a previous watchman write it as if it was the most important thing in the world? I logged my shift start, performed my initial perimeter sweep before midnight like protocol required, and kept my flashlight beam low, mostly on the ground where I stepped. I checked the gate lock. I checked the padlocks on the maintenance shed. I walked the main lanes, listening to the way my footsteps sounded different on gravel versus packed dirt versus scattered metal shavings. Everything was normal. I came back to the shack, made a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt plastic, and settled into routine. The first week was quiet enough that I almost forgot the rules existed. Every hour I did my check-in call. Every hour I walked the approved route. The yard felt inert, peaceful in a harsh way. The wind would move through the rows of cars and make them sing softly, a chorus of loose metal and old hinges, but it was the expected kind of noise. It was the kind of noise you get when you put thousands of pounds of scrap into an open desert and let the air do what it always does. I learned the camera blind zones not because anything ever happened in them, but because that was part of my job. Cameras had limitations, angles, glare. A stack of crushed metal could block a feed if it shifted. I would check and adjust where possible. When something looked off, I would note it. The yard had a radio channel assigned to security, though. There was no other security on my shift. It also had a channel used by day crew, and occasionally someone would forget to turn their handheld off, and I would hear a fragment of conversation from somebody driving home. It was mundane. It was comforting. My stakes were simple. I needed the job. I needed it to stay boring. I liked the isolation more than I admitted to myself. There is a certain peace in being the only conscious person in a defined space, responsible for it, a sense of competence. My world was reduced to monitors, a fence line, and a logbook. No surprises, that was why the first anomaly bothered me so much. It was small enough to dismiss, but precise enough to feel targeted. It happened on my 9th shift, a little after 1 in the morning. I had just finished a patrol and sat back down, checking the monitor grid. I kept a habit of scanning left to right, top row to bottom, so I could notice changes. Monitor 1, gate closed, quiet. Monitor 2, scale, empty. Monitor 3, main lane, floodlight glare. Monitor 4, parts pull area, shadows between shells of cars. Monitor 5, the crusher silent. Monitor 12, the orange tape lane. The tape was there, taut, bright. Then it wasn't. I blinked, leaned forward, and the feed showed the lane open, no tape, no obvious sign it had ever been there. The posts were bare. The rim pile sat unchanged. I did what any tired person would do. I assumed my eyes had played a trick, or that the camera feed had glitched and refreshed. I checked the timestamp on the monitor. The time overlay in the corner read 1:17 in the morning. It did not jump or flicker. I rewound the digital recorder feed because the system had a simple DVR interface. I pulled up the previous 10 minutes. At 1:13, the tape was there. At 1:14, it was gone. There was no movement on screen, no person walking up to untie it, no wind tugging it loose. It simply ceased to exist between frames like an edit. My first thought was that the camera was losing detail because of low light, but the floodlights were steady. The tape had been bright enough to show clearly. The posts were still visible. I went outside to confirm because part of my job was verification. The desert air was colder than I expected, dry and sharp. The floodlights made the yard look like a stage with no audience. My breath came out thin. The wind had settled into a low, constant push. I walked the safe route toward the back lanes, keeping myself on the main access aisles. When I reached the point where I could see the lane that had been taped off, my flashlight beam still down, I stopped. There was no tape. There were no scraps of it on the ground, no fluttering end tied to a post, nothing. I stood there for a full minute listening. The yard made its usual noises, wind, faint creaks, a distant metallic groan as something settled under its own weight. I told myself the tape had been removed by day crew. I told myself I hadn't noticed earlier. I told myself the DVR feed must have shown it because it had been there on a previous night and the system had some kind of overlay error. None of those explanations held up, but I wrote the incident down anyway in the logbook. Monitor 12 discrepancy, Hazard tape visible, then not visible. No activity observed. Verified in person. Tape absent. The next morning, when Parker arrived around 7, I mentioned it casually. "Huh," he said, flipping through the logbook without much interest. "Maybe the wind took it." "It was tied on both sides," I said. He shrugged like the difference didn't matter. "Tape comes and goes. You'll see." It was not an answer, but it was enough to make me feel like I was overreacting. I had a tendency toward procedural thinking, and procedural thinking can turn into paranoia if you let it. I did not want to be that guy who sees patterns in static. So I continued my routine, and the yard stayed inert, almost cooperative when I behaved as if the rules were nonsense. I did not walk the perimeter fence after midnight, but that was official protocol anyway because it was risky in the dark. I did not shine my flashlight into the back rows because it was easier to just use the floodlights and the cameras. I did not do inventory at night because that was day crew's job. I did not answer radio clicks because there was nobody to answer. I was, without meaning to, following most of the rules simply by doing my job conservatively. That was when the yard started to feel less like it was watching me and more like it was listening. It is hard to explain without sounding superstitious, but I will describe it in the most concrete way I can. When you are alone in a place long enough, you learn its baseline sound. You learn what normal quiet is. In the shack, with the heater ticking and the monitors humming, I could tell when the wind outside shifted direction because the pitch of the metal chorus changed. I could tell when a truck passed on the highway because the distant vibration carried through the ground. I could tell when a loose panel on a stacked car rattled because it made a sharper, higher sound than the rest. After 2 weeks, I noticed that when I stood up from the chair, the yard's baseline sound would change, almost as if something was adjusting its attention. The wind noise did not increase, but the pattern of the metallic creaks would shift into a brief synchrony, a subtle alignment, like all the loose parts were reacting to the same cue. If I remained seated, reading or watching the monitors, the yard stayed in its own rhythm. If I moved, it moved differently. I dismissed it as coincidence. I told myself it was just the wind timing itself with my movements. But the feeling persisted, and it did not feel like being watched. It felt like being heard. The first time the radio clicked twice in a row, I froze. It was around 2 in the morning, halfway through a patrol. I had stepped out of the shack and was walking the main lane past the crusher. The radio was clipped to my vest, volume low. The yard was quiet enough that my boots on gravel sounded too loud. Click. Click. 2 distinct clicks, spaced like someone pressing the talk button twice. No voice, no static, just the mechanical sound of activation. I stopped walking. My hand moved to the radio out of reflex, thumb hovering over the button. In any normal scenario, a double click could mean a handset glitch, a stuck button, or interference. It could also mean someone trying to get your attention without speaking. Rule 6. If the radio clicks twice in a row, do not respond even if you hear your name. I stood there with my thumb hovering and felt a sudden, irrational certainty that if I pressed the button, I would be confirming something, not a person, a condition. So I did not respond. I kept walking a little faster than before and returned to the shack sooner than planned. I told myself I was being cautious. I told myself caution was professionalism, not fear. I logged it as radio activation, unknown source. No voice traffic, no response given. The next day, I asked Parker if the yard had any other radios active at night. No, he said, just you. Sometimes a day crew guy forgets one in his truck, but it's off property by then. Could there be interference? I asked. He shrugged again. Out here? Maybe. You get weird signals, old mining equipment, ham guys, who knows? I accepted that because accepting it was easier than questioning it. Then the equipment malfunction forced my first deviation. It was a simple thing, a gate sensor fault at around midnight on a windy night. The yard had a contact sensor on the gate that would register if it was opened. It was tied to the camera system. If the gate moved, an alert would flash on the monitor. That was useful because the gate was the most likely breach point. It was also tied to my hourly calls. If the gate alert triggered, I was supposed to verify immediately. At midnight 12, the alert flashed. Gate open. I looked up. Monitor 1 showed the gate closed, chain in place, padlock intact. The alert remained. I reset it through the DVR interface. It returned within 30 seconds. I went outside and checked the gate physically. It was locked. I tugged on it. It did not budge. I logged it as a sensor fault, planned to report it to Parker in the morning, and went back to the shack. The alert continued to pop every few minutes. That was annoying, but manageable. Then at around 1 in the morning, the alert changed. Perimeter breach, east line. That was not a sensor I had been told about. There was no mention in the protocol binder of an east line breach sensor. The cameras covered the fence, but there were no alarms listed for it. The alert flashed on monitor 15, which was one of the back fence feeds. The image was grainy and low light. The fence line ran diagonally across the frame, and beyond it was desert brush. I saw nothing moving. The alert repeated. Professional instinct overrode everything else. A perimeter breach was my job. I needed to verify. Rule 1. Do not walk the perimeter fence after midnight. Camera verification only. This was after midnight. The rules said not to walk the perimeter fence. The official protocol did not forbid it, but it discouraged it. It was dark. The ground was uneven. I could trip, get cut, or worse. Still, if there was a breach, I had to confirm. I did the safest compromise. I took the ATV. There was a small utility ATV parked beside the shack, used by day crew for hauling tools and for quick checks. It had keys in a lockbox. Overnight Watchman was allowed to use it for perimeter sweeps if needed. Parker had mentioned it in passing. I started it, the engine coughing to life, and drove slowly down the main access aisle toward the east. Line. The wind picked up and the yard responded with louder rattles. The floodlights threw long shadows that made the stacked cars look like teeth. As I approached the east fence, the air felt different. Not colder, not warmer, but heavier. The sound of the ATV engine seemed muffled, as if the air was absorbing it. I stopped at a point where the fence line was visible. The chain link was intact. No cut, no sag, no sign of forced entry. Then, as I sat there, the wind shifted direction, and a loose door on a stripped sedan clanged shut somewhere in the back. The sound was sharp and isolated, as if it had happened right beside me. Rule 2. If you hear metal moving where there is no wind, stay in the shack until it stops. There was wind. I could feel it. But the door sound had been too clean, too precise, like a deliberate punctuation. I looked toward the back rows where the old inventory area began. From my angle, it was a dense cluster of silhouettes, cars stacked on cars, some upright, some crushed. The floodlights did not reach all the way back. There were pockets of darkness that felt too deep. I did not shine my flashlight into it. I kept the beam on the ground. I drove back to the shack, logged the alert as false, and tried to reset the system again. The breach alert stopped. The gate alert stopped too, as if the system had decided it had made its point. That night, when I sat in the shack with coffee cooling beside me, I opened the steel cabinet again and reread the handwritten rules slower than before. They did not feel like a prank anymore. They felt like a set of boundaries that someone had learned the hard way. And I began to notice other things. The way certain sections of the yard looked different depending on angle. It started with reflections. A windshield in the back row would catch the floodlight and flash briefly, even though no wind had moved it. A chrome bumper would reflect a shape that did not match what was around it. Then, it became spatial. I would look at a row of cars on monitor 9 and see a clear lane between them. Then I would look out the shack window at the same row and find the lane narrower, as if the stacks had leaned inward. When I checked again, it would be normal. I told myself it was depth perception, camera lens distortion, my eyes adjusting from screen to real space. But it happened too often, and it happened only with the back rows. I also started to notice the absence of other watchmen. Parker had said turnover was high. That was believable. Night security is not a job most people keep long. Still, I began to see evidence that there had been more structure at some point. Extra hooks on the wall for keys, a second chair in the shack storage closet, a spare badge lanyard, and in the protocol binder a section labeled shift handover notes with pages torn out. I asked Parker about it one morning, keeping my tone casual. "Did this used to be a 2-person shift?" I asked. He paused longer than usual, then said, "It used to be, yeah. Back when we had more theft attempts. We cut it. No need now." "Any reason the handover notes are missing?" I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw something like a warning in his expression. "Grant," he said, "this job is easy if you let it be easy. Don't go digging through ghosts." I nodded because I understood what he meant in the ordinary sense. Don't get invested. Don't chase workplace drama. Keep your head down. But the word ghosts stuck with me, and not in a playful way. By the 3rd week, curiosity had become a pressure. It built the way thirst builds. Slowly, until it is all you can think about. The orange tape lane appeared again, but not consistently. Some nights it was there on the monitor and in real life. Some nights it was absent. Once it was there on the monitor, but absent in real life. Another time it was absent on the monitor, but there in real life, a strip of tape glowing faintly under floodlight, tied off as if it had been there for years. Whenever I saw it, my body reacted before my mind. A subtle tightening, a reluctance to step closer, as if the air in front of it had weight. The rules had warned not to step into that aisle. They did not say why. They did not describe what would happen. They simply treated it as a fact. I began to rationalize. Maybe the lane was unstable. Maybe there was a sinkhole. Maybe the ground had subsided under the weight of scrap. Maybe someone had fallen in once and the tape was a crude warning. That would explain the rule. But it did not explain why the tape appeared and disappeared. On another night, a wind shift moved objects that should not have moved. The yard had heavy items, engines, axles, crushed metal cubes. Wind could move light things, loose plastic, paper, a dangling strip of insulation. But I watched a full tire mounted on a rim roll 6 feet across a lane and come to rest against a stack as if it had been pushed. The wind was strong, yes, but not that strong, and the roll was too controlled, too straight. I stood in the shack doorway and watched it happen. I did not go out to check. I told myself it was slope. I told myself the tire had been balanced in a way that made it ready to roll. Then the wind stopped, and the tire remained where it had stopped, as if it had reached its assigned position. I wrote it down in the logbook with a neutral tone. Observed tire movement in lane near crusher. Possible wind and grade. No further activity. As the weeks passed, the anomalies became more personal. I would hear my name in the radio static, faint, not clear enough to be a voice, but shaped like one. I would ignore it. I would see a shape in the back rows on monitor 14, not human, not clearly anything, just a density of shadow that seemed to stand upright among the stacked vehicles. I would look away and look back, and it would be gone. Rule 4 said that if I saw a person beyond the east access aisle, I should not acknowledge them. Close the blinds. Wait 10 minutes. They would leave if I did not make them real. I did not want to believe that rule, but one night at around 2:30 I saw what looked like a person walking between the back rows, far beyond where any employee should be. The shape was thin and slow, moving with a careful gait, as if navigating uneven ground. I stood up, heart rate increasing, and my first instinct was to grab the radio and challenge them. Standard protocol: identify yourself, announce that the property is monitored, instruct the person to leave, call law enforcement if they do not comply. Instead, my hand went to the blinds on the shack window. I closed them. I did not know why I did it. It was not rational. It was reflexive, like following a fire drill you don't remember learning. I sat back down, forced myself to look at the monitors, and set a timer on my phone for 10 minutes. I did not. Look at the back rows. When the timer buzzed, I opened the blinds and looked out. The yard was empty. The shape was gone. On the monitor feed, there was no sign of movement, no recorded figure. It was as if the camera had never seen it. That was when my sense of isolation shifted. I was alone in the obvious way. No co-workers, no customers, no traffic. But I was also alone in a more unsettling way. The systems that should have validated my perception were failing. The cameras did not confirm what my eyes saw. The radio did not confirm what my ears heard. The logbook was becoming a private record of things that did not exist for anyone else. That is how internal gaslighting happens. Not with a villain telling you that you're wrong, but with the world quietly refusing to agree with you. I began to test my own reality in small ways. I would count the floodlight poles visible from the shack window. There were 8 in my view. I would turn to the monitors, count them again from a different angle, and sometimes there would be 9. Sometimes there would be 7. I would blink, count again, and it would settle back to 8. Rule 5. The yard does not like being counted. Do not inventory at night. I stopped counting. Not because I believed the rule, but because I realized that counting was making me feel worse, and feeling worse was not helpful. I kept working. I kept my tone calm in my log. I kept my check-ins on the hour. But my curiosity grew into something sharper when I found the incident reports. It happened on a night when the wind was low and the yard felt too quiet, like a room waiting for someone to speak. I had finished a patrol early and decided to reorganize the shack cabinet, mostly to give my hands something to do. The cabinet held forms, spare batteries, a first aid kit, and old binders. Behind the protocol binder, I found a thinner folder labeled Incidents. It was not indexed in any official list. Inside were incomplete incident report forms. Not the blank ones. The filled ones, copies, some with coffee stains, some with torn corners. Many were missing signatures or final dispositions. Some were only half-filled, as if the writer had stopped mid-sentence. I read them carefully, because that is what you do when you find documentation relevant to your environment. The reports described things that sounded like my anomalies, but framed in professional language that tried to pin them down. Observed unauthorized individual in back rows. Subject did not respond to verbal challenge. Subject not visible on camera playback. Camera feed repetition at approximately 3:14 in the morning. All monitors displayed feed from camera C4. Power stable. No resolution. Radio interference. Heard own voice on channel. No other units active. Then one report stood out because it referenced the orange tape lane. Entered restricted aisle due to equipment retrieval. Spatial disorientation. Reported. Unable to locate exit. Returned after unknown duration. Noted missing time. There was a handwritten note in the margin pressed hard enough to leave an indentation. Do not enter again. Not a warning, a schedule. My mouth went dry as I read that. Another report dated months earlier referenced a watchman named Reed. It described him missing for 6 hours during a shift, then returning to the shack calm and disoriented. The final line was incomplete. Reed stated that the yard, the rest of the sentence was torn away. I sat back in the chair and stared at the monitors. The yard looked normal. The floodlights held steady. The desert beyond the fence was dark and empty. I realized then that someone had tried to document this and that the documentation had been removed, incomplete, or hidden. High turnover suddenly took on a different shape in my mind. Not people quitting, people not returning. I had to decide what to do with that information. Professional protocol would suggest escalating to management, reporting safety hazards, requesting maintenance. But how do you report a spatial disorientation in a scrapyard that rearranges itself? I did the only thing I could do without sounding insane. I took photos of the reports with my phone, then I put them back exactly where I found them. Over the next few shifts, the radio crackling became more frequent. Not voices, not clear messages, but partial responses, like someone on the other end starting to speak and stopping. I would call in my hourly check-in to the off-site line, and the line would answer with silence for a fraction of a second too long before the recorded tone. Once, it answered with my own voice saying, "All clear," in the flat tone I used on check-ins, and then it hung up. I stared at the handset, then called again. The line worked normally. I told myself it was a glitch. I told myself recording systems sometimes looped, but my stomach had begun to treat these glitches as threats. The decision point arrived slowly like dawn, except it was a dawn of dread. It came down to a single rule: the orange tape aisle. By then the tape had returned for 3 nights in a row. It was visible on camera and in real life. It was tied off at the entrance to an access aisle that ran between 2 long rows of stacked vehicles. The aisle was not on the map, or rather the map showed a lane there, but the lane was supposed to be open. The tape made it a boundary. On the 4th night, around 1:30, the floodlights in the back rows flickered. Not a full outage, a brief stutter like a power draw. Then they steadied. When they flickered, the monitor feeds jittered, and for an instant I saw something on monitor 12 that I could not categorize. The orange tape was gone, and the aisle behind it was not an aisle at all. It was a corridor of stacked cars that rose higher than they should have, creating a narrow canyon that did not exist in the yard layout. The shadows in it were not cast by the floodlights. They were their own darkness, dense and matte. Then the lights steadied and the tape was back and the aisle was normal. I sat very still, hands folded, and felt the quiet pressure of the yard around me. I thought about my job, about my need for the paycheck, about the fact that I was alone and that nobody would believe a story about a scrapyard that changed shape. I thought about the incident report note. Not a warning, a schedule. I began to wonder if the orange tape was not a simple marker but a timer, a placeholder, a delayed door. That was when equipment forced the issue again. The DVR system beeped and displayed an error. Camera 12 offline. Monitor 12 went black. Camera 12 covered the back aisle, the orange tape lane, the very place I had been avoiding and studying. If a camera went offline, I was required to verify in person. That was official protocol. Cameras were assets. Their failure created blind zones. Blind zones were security risks. I tried to reset the feed. No response. I checked the cable connections inside the shack. Everything looked intact. The fault reporting procedure said, verify camera physically, check for obstruction, report to management. The safe choice would have been to report it in the morning, but leaving a blind zone unverified for hours was negligent. If theft occurred, I would be responsible. If something happened and I had ignored it, I would have to answer for that. Professional anxiety is a lever. It can move you into bad decisions. I sat there debating, weighing what I knew against what I was expected to do. My mind tried to make it procedural. Option 1, Log camera failure, continue other duties, report at end of shift. Option 2, perform physical check, restore coverage if possible. The rules were a third voice in my head, quiet but persistent. Never step into the aisle marked with orange tape. Pulled the incident report folder out again and reread the torn forms, looking for anything that could serve as guidance. In one, a watchman had written, "If you must retrieve something from restricted, do it with eyes down. Do not look for more than you need." That line was also torn, as if someone had tried to remove it but failed fully. The radio clicked once, then again. Click, click. My shoulders tightened. I did not respond. The radio remained silent for a moment, then produced a burst of static that resolved into something like a breath, close to the microphone. Then nothing. I looked at the shack window blinds. They were open. The yard beyond was still. The floodlights hummed. I felt the last clear warning appear in a way that was not verbal. The air inside the shack shifted. The heater's ticking stopped. The monitor hum seemed to deepen. It was as if the room had been sealed, as if the pressure had changed by a fraction, enough that my ears noticed. And outside in the yard, every loose metal sound stopped at once. No wind rattle, no creak, no distant groan. A silence so complete it felt like a hand over my mouth. Then from somewhere in the back rose a single metallic sound, a slow, deliberate scrape, like a heavy object dragged across metal. There was wind outside. I could see dust moving in the floodlight beams. But the scrape did not match wind. It had intent. It had rhythm. Rule 2. If you hear metal moving where there is no wind, stay in the shack until it stops. I should have stayed. I did not. I told myself the scrape was the camera housing swinging loose. I told myself it was a panel. I told myself that if I did not check the camera, I was failing at the only thing I was paid to do. I grabbed my flashlight, clipped the radio more securely, and stepped out of the shack. The cold hit me immediately. The desert had dropped further in temperature. The floodlights made the gravel sparkle like tiny shards. As I walked, I kept my beam low, using it only to confirm footing. The yard was too quiet. Even my footsteps sounded muted, as if the gravel had absorbed them. I reached the point where the orange tape lane began. The tape was there, stretched across the entrance, fluttering slightly in the wind. The lane beyond looked normal. An access aisle between rows of stacked vehicles, dark at the far end, lit at the entrance. I stopped at the edge of it and waited, listening for any sign of movement. The scrape came again, closer from within the aisle, but I could not see anything moving. It was the sound of metal against metal, steady and slow, as if someone was dragging a chain. My instinct screamed at me to turn around. My procedural mind insisted that I needed to restore camera coverage. I lifted my flashlight slightly, but not into the back rows, just enough to catch the tape in the ground. The orange tape moved in the beam. It did not reflect light the way plastic should. It looked dull, almost matte, as if it absorbed the beam instead of reflecting it. That detail should have stopped me. Instead, it convinced me that the tape was old and dirty. I stepped forward. The moment my boot crossed the line of the tape, the sound changed. It was not dramatic. No roar, no sudden scream of wind. It was a dampening, as if someone had turned down the volume of the world. The floodlight hum became distant. The wind became a faint pressure on my skin rather than a sound. My own breathing sounded too loud in my ears. The ground beneath my feet felt subtly different, as if the gravel had been replaced by a finer grit. My boot soles did not crunch as loudly. I took another step and realized that depth was wrong. The cars on either side of the aisle seemed farther away than they should have been, as if the lane had widened without changing the visible boundaries. The stacks rose higher, stretching upward in a way that made my neck tighten as I looked. I forced myself to keep my eyes down, remembering the torn note, eyes down. I walked deeper into the aisle toward where camera 12 was mounted on a pole halfway down. I could see its silhouette against the floodlight glow. The scrape sound continued, but it shifted position relative to me in a way that made no sense. It was always ahead, always just out of sight, regardless of how far I walked. I reached the camera pole. The camera housing was intact. The lens was pointed correctly. The power indicator light was on. I waved my hand in front of it, then looked back toward the shack, expecting to see the red glow of the monitor rack through the window, or at least the floodlight line that marked the main lane. I did not see it. Behind me was the same aisle stretching back, but the entrance was not where it should have been. The orange tape line was gone. The yard beyond was not visible. The aisle extended into a faint haze of floodlight that seemed to come from nowhere. I turned slowly, scanning, and realized that the rows on either side had changed. The cars were not the same shells I had passed. The shapes were wrong. Some were older models, boxier. Some were colors I had not seen in the yard. The stacks were arranged differently, not in the orderly piles I knew, but in a way that felt intentional, like walls built from scrap. My first thought was that I had walked farther than I realized, that the aisle had curved, that my sense of direction was off. Then I looked down at my boots and saw that the grit beneath them was not gravel. It was fine metal filings like black sand. I stood very still, forcing my breathing to remain controlled because panic would not help. I had trained myself in security work to respond to unusual situations with procedure. Identify the problem, assess immediate danger, communicate, retreat if necessary. I tried to retrace my steps. I walked back the way I came, counting my steps in my head without actually inventorying the yard. 10 steps, 20 steps, 30 steps. The aisle did not change. It did not open. The orange tape did not appear. The shack did not come into view. My radio clicked once. I ignored it. The radio clicked again, then crackled with a voice that was almost mine. "Grant," it said softly, as if spoken close to the microphone. "You stepped in." My thumb twitched toward the button. I did not press it. I forced my voice to remain calm and spoke aloud into the air, not into the radio, as if that distinction mattered. "I am returning to the shack," I said. "Camera 12 appears physically intact. Feed failure likely internal." My words sounded wrong in the dampened air, too flat, as if the air did not carry them properly. I reached the point where the aisle should have opened into the main lane. Instead, it narrowed, and the stacked cars on either side leaned inward slightly, creating a funnel. The scrape sound stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I took another step and felt a subtle pressure change, like stepping into a room where the door has just been closed behind you. The yard rearranged behind me. I did not see it happen. I felt it the way you feel a building settle, a shift in geometry, a change in the way the floodlight glow fell on metal. I turned my head and saw that the aisle behind me was no longer straight. It bent gently to the left, vanishing behind a wall of stacked cars that had not been there before. My stomach dropped, but my mind remained stubbornly procedural. If the yard had changed, the cameras would show it. Cameras were objective. I ran back to the camera pole and looked at it again, as if it could give me answers. The indicator light was still on. I pulled my phone out and tried to call Parker. No signal. I tried the off-site line. No signal. The phone showed full bars of nothing, as if it was connected to a tower that refused to acknowledge my existence. I looked up and realized that the floodlights above the aisle were not the same poles. The light was coming from fixtures that were too high and too far, casting shadows that did not align with any structure I knew. It was light without a source. That was the threshold moment, though I did not have language for it then. I had crossed a line, and the line had not been a prohibition. It had been a delay. The rule did not forbid entry. It postponed it until the moment I could justify stepping in, until the moment I would tell myself I had no choice. I tried to walk faster, then slower, then stopped and listened. In the distance, beyond the scrap walls, I heard something like footsteps, not on gravel, on metal. Slow, careful steps that matched the earlier scrape rhythm. I kept my eyes down. I moved along the bent aisle, searching for any landmark that would orient me. A distinctive car, a sign, a pole, anything. The yard had always been a maze, but it had been my maze. I knew its angles. I knew its rhythm. This was a different maze wearing the same materials. After what felt like 10 minutes, I came to an opening where the aisle widened into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a time clock, not a digital wall clock, a physical employee time clock like you see in old warehouses, the kind that stamps a card when you insert it. It sat on a metal pedestal, plugged into nothing, lit by the sourceless floodlight glow. Beside it was a stack of time cards, thick, worn, each card in a slot labeled with a name. I approached slowly, heart pounding but breath controlled. Rule 10. If the time clock shows a time you did not live through, write it down and do not attempt to correct it. I had not seen a time clock in the yard. The shack had a simple wall clock. The office had digital systems. There was no stamping clock. I reached out and touched the time clock casing. It was cold, but not metal cold. It was cold like stone. The display window showed a stamped time on a card that was half inserted. 3:14 in the morning, the same time referenced in Rule 8. I stared at it and my mind tried to rationalize. Someone had moved an old time clock into the yard as scrap. Maybe it had been sitting back here for years. But the card was fresh. The ink looked wet. Then the time on the card changed without the card moving. It stamped again over the previous stamp as if an invisible punch had hit it. 3:15 in the morning. My throat tightened. I pulled the card out with trembling fingers and read the stamped digits, forcing myself to process them as individual spoken digits in my mind, because that was how I handled stress. Break it down into smaller pieces. 315. The card had my name at the top in block letters. Grant, my badge number printed beneath it. 3169. I had never seen my badge number anywhere except on my badge and in the company system. It was not something a stranger would casually know. I looked at the stack of cards. There were other names, some crossed out, some smeared, some missing. Reed, Quinn, Drew, Morgan. Names that felt familiar in the vague way that paperwork can feel familiar when you handle enough of it. I heard the radio click twice again, louder this time, as if the sound had moved closer to my ear. I did not respond. I backed away from the time clock and felt the air shift behind me. I turned my head slightly and saw in the periphery a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Not fully visible, not lit properly. A silhouette that seemed to be made of shadow and the suggestion of a person wearing a reflective vest. I did not look directly at it. Rule 4. If you see a person beyond the east access aisle, do not acknowledge them. Close the blinds. Wait 10 minutes. They will leave if you do not make them real. There were no blinds here. There was no shack. But the rule's logic remained. Do not acknowledge. Do not confirm. Do not make it real. I turned my eyes down to the ground and walked away from the clearing, moving back into the aisle without looking back. The footsteps followed at a distance, always matching my pace, never catching up, never falling behind. Time perception fractured. That is the most accurate phrase I can use. In normal circumstances, you can estimate time by your body, breath rate, fatigue, the rhythm of steps. In this altered yard, those cues became unreliable. The air was dampening sound, altering perception. The light was sourceless, making shadows meaningless. My phone had no signal and no accurate clock display. It flickered between times as if searching for a network. I walked for what felt like an hour, then checked my phone and saw that it read 9 in the evening. I blinked, and it read 4 in the morning. I looked away, and it read 8 in the evening again. Rule 10 said to write down any time you did not live through. I had no logbook, but I had the back of my hand and a pen in my pocket. I wrote the times as they appeared one after another in small, careful letters. 8 in the evening, 4 in the morning, 9 in the evening, 3:26 in the morning, 2 in the morning, 6 in the morning, 8 in the evening again. My hand began to look like a crowded margin in a notebook. I kept walking, trying to find the shack, trying to find the main lane, trying to find anything familiar. At one point, the aisle opened into another clearing, and in that clearing were the surveillance monitors, not the ones in the shack. A wall of screens mounted on scrap frames, all showing the same feed. Rule 8. At 3:14 in the morning, all monitors may show the same feed. This is not a power issue. Close your eyes until you hear the office line ring. The feed on every screen showed the inside of the guard shack, my guard shack. I could see the chair empty. I could see the desk. I could see the coffee cup still sitting there. I could see the blinds half open. Then on the screen I saw myself. Not in the clearing, but in the shack feed, sitting in the chair, staring at the monitors, hands folded as if waiting. The image did not move like a normal live feed. It had a slight lag, a stutter, as if the frame rate was wrong. But the figure was clearly me. Same vest, same badge. I felt my skin prickle. My mouth went dry. I looked down at my own chest, at my badge. It was there. I was standing in the aisle, not sitting in the shack. The screen version of me turned its head slowly, as if looking directly into the camera. Then it smiled, a small professional smile, the kind you give when you are acknowledging a coworker. My radio clicked twice again. This time the voice that followed was not mine. It was Parker's voice, distorted by static, saying, "Grant, you don't come back once you cross." My knees threatened to buckle. I forced myself to remain upright. I closed my eyes. I did not know if I did. Was it 3:14 in the morning? But I closed my eyes anyway, because Rule 8 had become less like superstition and more like a survival instruction. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I heard the yard's baseline sound return faintly. Wind through metal, distant hum. Then I heard a phone ring. Not my phone. A landline ring, the kind of ring the office line had in the shack. 2 short rings, then a pause. I opened my eyes. The wall of monitors was gone. I stood in a different aisle, narrower, with a familiar pattern of stacked cars on either side. The floodlights above were real poles now, their hum audible. The wind was back in full sound, rattling metal. I turned and saw at the far end of the aisle the guard shack. Relief surged through me so hard it felt like pain. I walked toward it quickly, then slowed when I realized something was wrong. The shack door was open. The interior light was on. And sitting at the desk, facing the monitor rack, was the version of me I had seen on the screens. He sat very still, posture perfect, hands folded, eyes fixed on the monitors. My coffee cup was in front of him. I stopped in the aisle, breath catching. The figure did not turn. It did not react to my presence. I raised my radio and spoke into it for the first time in hours because the urge to confirm reality became unbearable. "This is Grant," I said, voice steady despite the tremor in my hand. "If anyone is on channel, respond." The radio answered with my own voice, immediate and calm. "All clear." The figure in the shack shifted slightly as if it had heard the radio. Then it reached for the logbook and began to write. I stood outside watching and realized I could not remember leaving the shack. I could not remember the exact moment I stepped out for the camera check. I remembered deciding. I remembered crossing the tape, but the transition between those memories felt blurred, like a cut in a film. My mind began to search for continuity and found gaps. I took a step toward the shack. The gravel crunched under my boot, loud and real. The figure inside paused, writing. It turned its head slowly, and this time it looked directly at me through the window. It had my face, but the expression was wrong. Too calm, too settled, like someone who had accepted a role and no longer questioned it. It lifted a hand in a small wave, not threatening, not welcoming, just acknowledging. Then it pointed slowly toward the back rows, toward the orange tape aisle. My stomach clenched. I backed away from the shack and looked around, trying to orient myself. The yard looked normal again. Familiar lanes, familiar stacks, familiar floodlight poles. The desert fence line in the distance. But something had shifted in my perception. The yard felt less like a place I was guarding and more like a system I was inside. I walked around the shack to the door, intending to enter, intending to confront the figure, intending to prove something. The door was locked. From the inside, my keys did not work. My fob did not work. The lock clicked as if rejecting them. I tried the window. It did not open. I stepped back and looked through the glass again. The figure inside continued writing in the logbook, methodical, professional. It looked up at the monitors occasionally, scanning left to right, top row to bottom. My routine, my habits, my competence replicated. The radio on my vest clicked once, then twice. I did not respond. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. There was a missed call notification. From my own number. Rule 9. If you receive a call from inside the yard, do not answer. There are no phones in the yard. My hands shook. I did not call back. Instead, I did what my job had trained me to do when locked out of a secure area. Assess alternative access points. Windows, emergency key box, maintenance hatch. There was no hatch. No emergency key. The shack was designed to keep, people out. I realized with a slow, sinking certainty that I was now outside the safe side. The safe side had not been the yard itself. It had been the shack. It had been the position of observer. The point where cameras and logs and protocols created a buffer between me and whatever the yard contained. By crossing the orange tape aisle, I had moved from observer to participant. I turned toward the back rows because I did not know what else to do. The yard, in full sound now, seemed to respond. The wind picked up slightly and metal rattled in a pattern that sounded almost like applause. I walked along the main access aisle toward the back, keeping my eyes forward, trying not to look into the deep shadow pockets. My flashlight remained pointed down. The floodlights felt harsher now, less like illumination and more like interrogation. As I walked, I noticed that the cameras mounted on poles seemed to track me. Not physically turning, but the red indicator lights seemed to brighten when I passed, as if acknowledging that I was now within their attention. I reached the orange tape lane again. The tape was there, fluttering, but now it was behind me. I realized that without noticing I had approached it from the other side. The yard had repositioned me in relation to it. The aisle was now an exit, not an entrance, and the tape was a boundary I could see but not cross back over. I stepped up to it and reached out, intending to lift it, to step over, to return to the known lanes. The tape felt wrong under my fingers. It was not plastic. It had a texture like dried skin. I let go immediately, hand recoiling. The radio clicked twice. This time the voice was not mine and not Parker's. It was a neutral, bureaucratic voice, like a recorded message. Perimeter integrity confirmed, it said. Asset in place. I stood there, breathing slowly, trying to keep my mind from fracturing. Then I understood, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow assembling of evidence. The yard was not abandoned. It was contained. The rules were not superstition. They were maintenance instructions for a boundary. They were written by someone who had realized that the job was not to keep people out of the yard, but to keep the yard's wrongness from crossing outward. The watchmen were not guards. We were plugs in a system. We were the ones who sat on the safe side and watched, so the yard could remain unseen, uncounted, unacknowledged. We were the ones who did not respond to the radio clicks, who did not look too closely, who did not inventory, who did not confirm what was beyond the east access aisle. We were the human component of containment, because the yard needed an observer to define its boundary, and it needed that observer to remain outside the threshold, until eventually it needed a replacement inside. I remembered the incident report about Reed missing for 6 hours and returning calm. I remembered the torn sentence. Reed stated that the yard... I completed it in my mind with a chill. The yard stated him. It made him part of its structure. I looked back toward the guard shack and saw the figure still inside, still writing, still performing my role. It was not a doppelganger in a cinematic sense. It was my function, my routine, my professionalism. Preserved on the safe side to keep the boundary stable. And I, the part that questioned, the part that stepped over tape, had been moved to the wrong side. A contained area needs a caretaker. Not someone who escapes, but someone who remains and makes sure the containment holds. I realized then why the rules emphasized not acknowledging things. Acknowledgement was not just fear. It was creation. Making something real by observing it, counting it, responding to it. The yard's anomalies were responsive to attention, not touch. The objects did not move because the wind pushed them. They moved because the yard system adjusted to the observer's focus. That was why the tire rolled straight. That was why the tape appeared and disappeared. That was why the cameras did not record the figure I saw. The yard controlled what the system validated. And now, without the shack, without the logs, without the safe side, my attention was the only thing left to define my world. That was the immediate wrongness, irreversibility. I tried once more to walk away from the orange tape lane, toward the fence line, toward the gate, toward the desert road. I followed the main lane, confident in the layout I knew. After 10 minutes, I reached the crusher again. After another 10, I reached it again. The yard looped, not physically like a maze, conceptually like a set of connected frames that always return to the same points. I marked my path by placing small objects, a bolt, a scrap of cloth, a rock. Each time I returned, the markers were gone, or replaced by different objects that looked similar but not the same. The cameras I passed showed feeds that did not match my surroundings. On one pole, I looked up at a camera and saw its indicator light. I climbed the pole ladder a few rungs and looked directly into the lens, trying to force it to record me. Later, when I found a monitor screen in the yard, it showed an empty lane. The yard refused to validate my presence from within. Time continued to fracture. The phone clock flickered. The floodlights sometimes hummed at different pitches. My body felt fatigue that did not align with hours. At one point, I found a clipboard nailed to a post. It held an incident log sheet, blank except for one line written in tight handwriting. Final patrol begins when you stop looking for the way out. I stared at that line for a long time. Then I realized that I had been trying to escape as if this was a physical problem, as if I could find a gate and drive away. But containment is not escaped by walking. Containment is a function. If I was now the system. My only possible role was maintenance. The yard needed someone on the inside to keep the boundary from collapsing inward. Someone to keep things in place, not by force, but by observation and routine. The rules were written for the outside watchman, but they implied something else, that once you crossed, the rules changed. I began to patrol again, not as escape, but as procedure. I walked the lanes and noted the places where the geometry felt thin, where the air dampened sound, where the light looked too flat. I learned where not to look because looking made the wrongness sharpen. I learned where to stand to keep the yard quiet because standing in certain places made the metal chorus settle into a more stable pattern. I became gradually an operator. The strangest part was that as I accepted the role, the panic diminished. My mind returned to calm not because the situation improved, but because procedure gave me something to hold. That is one of the most, frightening truths about professional conditioning. You can adapt to almost anything if you frame it as duty. I do not know how many days or nights passed in that altered yard. Time did not behave normally. Hunger came and went without clear cause. Thirst was present but manageable, as if my body was being kept at a sustainable threshold. Sometimes I saw figures in reflective vests between the rows, always in periphery, always just far enough that direct sight would confirm them. I never looked directly. Sometimes the radio clicked twice and whispered instructions in my voice. Don't count. Eyes down. Stay on the safe side, even though there was no safe side left for me. Once I heard Parker's voice again, clearer, saying, "We didn't hire you to guard scrap, Grant." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to demand answers. But I understood that communication was part of the yard's system, not a human connection. Parker's voice might have been real once, but here it was a tool. Eventually, I found the time clock clearing again. The time clock was still stamping cards, sliding in and out as if handled by invisible hands. My card was there, stamped over and over with times that did not align. 3:14 in the morning, 8 in the evening, 6 in the morning, 3:14 again. I did not correct it. I did not try to pull the card out again. Instead, I found another card, one that had been pulled halfway free as if someone had tried to remove it. The name on it was Reed. The card was stamped with a time that made my skin crawl because it was not a time. It was a duration, written as if time itself had become a line item. Shift ongoing. I stared at that until my eyes hurt. Then I looked at the slots and saw with a slow dread that the number of empty slots was increasing. Not because people were leaving, but because the yard was running out of names to assign. Containment requires staffing, and requires turnover. That was when the final understanding settled in, the one that reframed everything. The yard did not exist to store scrap. It existed to store what could not be stored anywhere else. It was a boundary for a kind of wrongness that needed a physical analog. Stacked cars, crushed metal, a maze that could rearrange and still feel plausible. A place where anomalies could hide in shadow pockets and industrial noise. The watchmen were part of the system because a boundary needs witnesses. Someone to define what is inside and what is outside. Someone to ignore what should not become real. When a watchman failed, when curiosity or necessity pushed them to cross, the system did not punish them. It reassigned them. It placed their function on the safe side as an automated routine, a calm figure in the shack making hourly calls, scanning monitors, writing logs. And it placed their questioning self on the inside to patrol and maintain. A contained anomaly does not want to escape in a dramatic burst. It wants to expand quietly by rewriting the rules of what is normal. And the easiest way to expand is to make containment feel like employment. My testimony, the reason I am speaking now in this measured way, is not because I escaped. It is because the system allows documentation at specific points, like pressure valves. There are moments when the boundary thins and communication leaks out, perhaps to recruit, perhaps to normalize. perhaps to spread the idea of the yard so it can exist in more minds. I do not know which. I only know that sometimes in the altered yard I would find a desk that should not be there with paper and a pen, and I would feel an urge to write everything down in the calmest way possible. The yard liked documentation as long as it stayed within procedure. It liked testimony because testimony is a kind of counting, and counting creates structure. I still performed patrols. I still listened for changes in the metal. Chorus. I still avoided direct acknowledgement of figures. I still kept my eyes down in the back rows. I still did not respond to radio clicks. And sometimes I would see on a monitor screen mounted on scrap the outside world. The real guard shack, the real yard layout, the gate closed, the desert road beyond. And in the shack I would see the calm figure of myself, scanning monitors, writing logs, making hourly calls. He never looked tired, he never looked afraid. He looked like someone doing a job that was simple. Once I saw Parker enter the shack in that feed. He spoke to the figure. I could not hear what he said, but the figure nodded. Parker handed him something, maybe a new set of keys, maybe a new protocol binder. Parker looked out the window toward the yard, and for a moment his gaze aligned with the camera, and I felt absurdly that he could see me. He did not react. He left. The figure remained. The feed cut back to static. That was when I understood that. Parker was not ignorant. He might not have written the rules, but he had learned to live with them. The yard was privately owned, yes, but ownership is a legal fiction compared to whatever system had taken root there. Parker's business existed because containment needed a cover story. Scrap gave a reason for fences, for floodlights, for cameras, for isolation, for people like me to sit alone and watch. Every procedural detail I had found comforting was part of the mechanism. Asset tagging, perimeter sweeps, camera blind zones, incident logging, hourly check-ins. All of it was a ritual that kept the boundary defined, and when I crossed, I became infrastructure. My final patrol, the one that confirmed the permanence of my position, happened on a night that might have been a night, or might have been an endless loop of night. The wind was high, rattling every loose panel in the yard. The floodlights flickered briefly, then steadied. The metal chorus rose and fell like a living thing. I walked the main lane and realized I no longer remembered what my apartment looked like. I could picture the layout in an abstract way, but the sensory memory was gone. The smell, the feel of the couch fabric, the sound of my refrigerator. Those details had been stripped away as if they were not relevant to my function here. In their place, I could recall the yard with perfect clarity. Every lane, every pole, every shadow pocket. That was the transformation. Not physical, not dramatic, cognitive. Identity eroded until only role remained. I approached the orange tape lane from the inside and saw for the first time that the tape was not tied to posts at all. It was connected to nothing, hovering at the entrance as a line of color that the yard maintained because it needed me to perceive a boundary there. It fluttered in wind that did not touch it. I reached out and did not touch it. I did not need to. I understood. On the other side of the tape, I saw the normal yard, the safe side, the shack, the monitors, the routine. And standing beside the shack outside in the yard was a new figure, a man in a reflective vest holding a flashlight beam low, walking cautiously toward the back rows. A new watchman arriving for his shift. He moved with the careful professionalism of someone who wanted to do the job right. He paused at the cabinet inside the shack and found the rules. I could not see the paper from here, but I knew the moment he read them because his posture stiffened. He looked out the shack window toward the yard. His head tilted slightly, as if listening. The yard's metal chorus shifted in response. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, like an urge to reach through the boundary and warn him, to tell him not to rationalize, not to let professional anxiety become a lever. My radio clicked twice, loud and clear. I did not respond. The new watchman stepped out of the shack and began his perimeter sweep before midnight on the safe side, just like I had. Everything proceeded, containment maintained. The yard waited. I understood then that my existence on the wrong side was not an accident. It was a position, a maintenance role, a contained consciousness that patrolled and kept the inner geometry stable, and that the yard did not want to escape by force. It wanted to be staffed. Sometimes when the wind is low and the floodlights hold steady, I can still hear the off-site line ring faintly from somewhere that is not the shack. It rings twice, pauses, rings twice again, and then stops, as if the call was never meant to be answered. I have stopped trying to remember what came before this job because remembering makes the walls shift. The safest thing I can do now is keep walking my lanes and not look too closely at the places where the yard feels thin, because I have started to suspect the boundary is not keeping something in. It is keeping something out, and it is learning my name.